Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Salesforce webinar focused on best practices in the public sector. I'm moderating this panel, Michael Crosby with Leadership Connect. Today, our aim with our panel is to give you actionable ideas to make your project or your next project a success and avoid some of the pain that our panelists today, along with myself, have experienced in the past. So we all know that Salesforce is a juggernaut in CRM. It's truly a connective platform for running CRM initiatives, along with integrating, a vast ecosystem of applications and supporting your goals. But it's also aged many an IT and organizational executive. But if it's good enough for Matthew McConaughey, it should be good enough for all of us, according to Salesforce. Today, we're going to focus on scoping, culture, implementation, and scaling, what works and what doesn't, from a public sector perspective. And to lead this discussion, we have a great panel. We have Marcellus Walker, Chief of 3011 Operations with the City of DC, the Office of United Communications. Thank you, Marcellus, for joining us. I'm sure it's been a busy week. He'll be giving us the agency perspective and integrating complicated applications. And then we have Valerie Vasquez with us, Air Force and startup guru with True Anomaly, Director of Global Public Policy and Regulatory Strategy. Thank you, Valerie, for joining us. To lead off this panel, I'll ask Marcellus and Val to give a little background on themselves, and then start off with really where to start when looking, considering a new Salesforce project or expanding what you have. And Marcellus, you're on my left, so we'll start with you first.
Awesome. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you. A little bit of my background. I've been in DC government employee for roughly 15 plus years. Worked with various unions and worked in the agency as a call taker. I've been graciously given the opportunity to lead the 301 operations with the Office of Unified Communication. And so with this as well being centered in the same center as 911 operations, to your question of where to start, we live in a world where there's reporting is necessary. Cloud efficiency is important, and the ability to just make sure that we have more control over the different features of the different systems that we have is very important. And so that's definitely somewhere where you want to start to be able to view the goals and mission that your agency has set forth, and look for those platforms that best fit that mission.
Awesome. Thanks, Marcellus. And Val.
Hi, Val Vasquez. I have about 20 years of experience across the U.S. government, industry, and kind of spanning to focus on working U.S. government initiatives to support industrial cooperation with our foreign partners. And now currently at True Anomaly, I work to do this on the industry side. So my unique experience working in startups has kind of provided me the insight of understanding how Salesforce starts from the ground floor in a company. So I think my advice on where to start would be, be realistic about your project scope, right? You don't have to have Salesforce integrated into everything that your company is doing up front, but do a crawl, walk, run approach to understand, okay, with the personnel that I have, the resourcing and the time, what is most effective for our team to get started with first on Salesforce, so that we can have the best result and then build and scale from there based on that collaborative buy-in within the team. And that buy-in will then help define those goals so that everybody is on board with how to use Salesforce, how to integrate Salesforce within the capacity of your work streams, and then to understand those requirements and projecting, the required activities and tasks and timelines that your team is looking to accomplish.
Awesome. Thanks, Val. I'm Michael Crosby, so I'm CEO of Leadership Connect, so we're a people intelligence service. We actually have integrated our service into, several dozen agencies. So we have close to 100 implementations with the public sector, both within agencies and the nonprofit contractor community. Prior to this, I've been involved in probably 400 implementations across, primarily professional services in the banking space, from large to small. And I echo Marcellus and Val's input that scoping up front, not biting off more than you can chew, is key. But I feel the most important thing is our second question is culture. So maybe Val, I'll start with you on this one. Like, how do you know if you have the right culture, the right ingredients to implement Salesforce before you even get started?
Yeah, so I think that kind of falls into three buckets from my perspective: the buy-in, the collaboration, and then understanding the continuous improvement initiatives that your team would have to invest in. So from the buy-in, I worked for one company that was all in on Salesforce and how they wanted to integrate it, understood the complexities of it, what it would take for their team to get trained, and how they needed to institute processes in order to have data integrity to make Salesforce most effective for the company. I worked for another company that didn't really have a plan on how to institute Air Force, and didn't really have collaborative buy-in on how it was going to be used and how it would be seen as being most effective for the company. These were two kind of really dynamic experiences and different experiences that kind of led me to understand the importance of this buy-in piece, and having leadership really focus on creating those initiatives and processes in place to be able to make sure that Salesforce is most effective for your team. And that the team understands the need to use it, and having it be collaborative to understand, okay, we're not just going to buy like 3 licenses or 5 licenses, but we're going to actually staff the team effectively to be able to be bought in themselves on wanting to use Salesforce and seeing it as a great asset for their company. And then the company investing in the continuous improvement, not only to have the add-ins like Leadership Connect or add-ins for teams that can be really helpful in tracking and Outlook, but also invest in training the team on how to use it.
That's great, Val. Marcellus, your thoughts on culture?
Yeah, I think Val definitely hit it on the head with the buy-in. In my situation within the government, when we're looking at new systems and new platforms, we have a separate agency called OCTO, Office of the Chief Technology Officer, that we're there really doing the lead work and researching things because they understand that technical background. And so what we had to do on the operational side is just to make sure that we involved our staff in the testing phase, to make sure that we identified some needs, because the decision was already made. And so I just had to kind of make sure we brought the team up to par with different needs that they may have, and really getting, again, their buy-in, and making sure that they understand that this system is to help you, which in turns will help you help that resident in the service that you provide. And then, also within that, because 311 we're housed in the same environment as 911, there's just already this sense of understanding that you have to be flexible. And so one day there may be a system that you have to use, and just understand that the leadership has to prepare our staff to make sure that they understand that with these advances, with the evolution of technology, things are going to change. And so we have to have the right change management leaders in place to make sure that we're bringing the people along with that as well.
Thanks, Marcellus. And I'm glad you brought up change, because those are 3 words that I feel drive a lot of failure within Salesforce. Is people hate change. It's with culture. The best laid plans fall apart, and if people were open to change, I mean, we'd all be in the gym every day and eating celery sticks for lunch. So we see implementations, when they fail, it's often the cultural piece that it's too much too soon, or people aren't willing to work with the new system, or, often in many cases, we're requiring our teams to enter a lot of data, and, maybe they're not data entry experts, or they don't feel like that's a good use of their time. So even though we're talking Salesforce, and it's also, normally thought of in the realm of a technical implementation, the people and cultural aspect, I think, is really paramount, because if you can't get people on board, as Marcellus mentioned, it's going to fail every time. So, it's knowing, we've all tried to, train parents and grandparents on how valuable a smartphone or iPad is for, communicating with the family and the kids. And that's not necessarily the easiest experience. So, thinking about how to introduce change, culturally in micro doses can often work. But, Marcellus, you mentioned Octo and having a technical partner. Beyond culture, talent is probably the next biggest area that means the difference between success and failure. Do you want to start with us on talent?
Absolutely. I want to say, it was very, it was super important that our internal technical team was along the ride of this process from beginning to end. Because again, they're the experts. Me myself, I'm operational, and so I want to make sure that I lean on them. I want to make sure that I'm learning from them as well. And so, having that internal team in the room that understands what your mission and what your goals are, the assistance, the service that you're providing to the public, was very, very important. And we actually, pulled from talent from different agencies. Maybe bringing a contractor in who had a specific engineering skill set, who understood what it takes to do that implementation, but also the operational team building a relationship with that technical team to make sure that we're all on the same page to move this thing forward. So the technical talent was very, very important, because I think that also translated to less waste. I think sometimes in DC government, we may buy a new tool and it has all of these 15, 20 different features. And sometimes we want to try to use all of those features, but we may only need just these 5 features that really drive us home. And so being able to understand that and not having so much waste, I think was paramount to the talent.
And Marcellus, a follow-up, like when you think of talent, because, often with Salesforce, whether it's Salesforce or a third-party app that is, connected to Salesforce, everyone says it's easy to work with. Like, oh, it's out of the box, no worries. But, you have, kind of developers, admins, project management experts. Like, when you think of the ecosystem of talent you need to implement a project, can you kind of categorize who people should be thinking of and bringing into the mix?
Absolutely. I would definitely say, with the project management, understanding, working very closely with Octo, our technology agency, making sure that they understand what our needs are. And I would say, there were certain engineers that may have been very experienced or already had experience with Salesforce. So that was really important, that they had that experience. And it was just essential, to the implementation part. The admin side of it, on the administrative side of it, we had to have someone that was going to be able to train them. So once, we say we're deciding we're going to move to this, there had to be someone kind of with that technical and administrative ability to kind of set up a training. And in our case, because we partner with so many different district government agencies and they're using this platform, there were even times where supervisors and managers and this admin technical person would have to go out to other agencies, kind of train them on how to use the platform and what to do. And so definitely someone that can communicate very well across various levels of officials and governments, can give you, elevator speech to the executive, but also can break it down to that that person that's on the floor working with the tool, I think was really important as well.
Yeah, that's great. And what we see in a successful kind of talent support is number one, you've assessed what talent you need to use in an implementation. Don't go in there with a Salesforce admin when you really need a development team to do the integration. Sometimes you really can't see around the corner in terms of how complex a rollout is. So you might have to commit some time to do a pilot in order to really scope how complex something is, especially with public sector data. It tends to be, sometimes a little messy, very hierarchical, a lot of different systems, legacy systems. So when we see something take forever or not hit the mark in terms of expectations, it's often because it wasn't scoped properly and you couldn't see all of the angles of that implementation up front without investing a little bit of work around a pilot or a partial rollout. So it really kind of suggests you kind of communicate that, and we'll get to that on a later topic with the executive team, because the talent is such a critical part. One reminder as we're going through, if you have questions, please use the Q&A and we'll address them as we go through each topic, or if it's a totally different topic, we'll get to it at the end. So let's talk about like when the project's not going well. Like, we're all in technology, so the idea that you can solve any problem using technology is probably ingrained into our DNA. But sometimes you have to know, when to say when and when to move on from a particular aspect of the project or to give up on something entirely. Val, maybe start with you on your thoughts on when have you taken a project too far and parts of it are not working, or even the whole thing's not working?
Yeah, I think from an industry perspective, understanding the return on investment and the cost impacts to that. So how is utilizing a platform potentially having adverse effects on your business operations? So understanding, okay, like kind of the things that we talked about in the beginning, like, is there buy-in among the technical team, among the sales team, among, the individual stakeholders that have looked at and said, okay, this is how we want to roll this out. And we're providing data integrity by utilizing Salesforce and inputting into it. If so, those things aren't happening and you're not getting that buy-in and you're not getting the collaboration, and then maybe one team says, well, why am I what's the return on investment for the company if I'm inputting all of this data and there's no data integrity across the span of the company? So looking at those things and then saying, okay, well, how much am I actually paying for my licenses on Salesforce? Did we really have an effective implementation plan across the spectrum of the company to say, okay, this is how we're going to implement this. This is going to be the ROI, that return on investment to business operations across the whole company. And if that's not there, then that's kind of when you have to reevaluate, okay, maybe we need to down scope and have realistic project scope for what we're doing, because what we're doing now isn't realistic. Or looking at, okay, maybe we're not ready for Salesforce. Maybe we need to, utilize some of the things that we have existing. And then once we have the effective personnel in place, the effective resourcing and time, then we can then have an accurate, effective Salesforce rollout.
That's really helpful. Marcellus, what are your thoughts? Because you actually, experienced this with your team.
Sorry, but no, I think that that was spot on. One thing that comes to mind when I started in the role, and the director that we had at the time, we were thinking about going to a new telephony system, and she simply just said, "Hey, kid, let's start off with can it do the things that we need that the previous system or the legacy system doing? Can it do those things better?" And I think if we start there with the basics, hey, can it do the basics? Can my team transfer a call, put a call on hold, conference a call in, and there won't be any issues? And so, once we kind of start there, I think you build in a phased approach to make sure that you kind of identify what's working and what's not working. And then that'll kind of drive the discussion on how we want to move on, or maybe there's a new or updated platform. I know back in about 2017, we were still on the Salesforce platform. We just transitioned to a capsule platform. And that was super helpful because we were able to see what other jurisdictions were doing, some of the features that they have within 311 in Baltimore and in Houston, what they were doing. And so that kind of opened up our perspective to be able to really understand what we can do with that, and also, build relationships with those companies, and you kind of get that understanding. Okay, you're working with this company. What are some of the things that you're going through, and so learning from them as well.
Great points, Marcellus. I'll build on Val, what you were mentioning. I would kind of split it into two groups. So one, if it's within the Salesforce ecosystem, you're not bringing in a third-party app. Often, if you have to pull back, it's a cultural issue where you're asking your team to do too much too soon, and often you get dashboard envy. You look at those initial dashboards when you're getting pitched on Salesforce or doing a bigger project. You're like, wow, if I can populate that, I can really run my organization more effectively. But then it requires all of this, buy-in and administrative commitment by your team in order to make those dashboards actually operate. So sometimes it's too much too soon. So certainly within the Salesforce app itself, we've dialed things back and seen our clients dial stuff back if it's just they can't get their team there that quickly, and they kind of again probably overscoped or didn't do a pilot effectively or long enough. The second one we see is with integrating a third-party app, whether it's an email system, an accounting system, client success, whatever it is. And again, I think when you have to pull back, it's because, hey, this is a much bigger technical integration than we thought. We thought this might take a week or two, and this is going to be 6 months. And instead of it being, thousands of dollars of development time, it's, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think that's, again, sometimes those things you just really can't account for because of all the, complexities of the interactions between different systems you're using. But I do think you should upfront, figure out like, when are you going to wave the white flag and say like, okay, we think this is going to take 3 months. If it takes a year, are we in for that? Because sometimes if the project goes on too long, it gets too expensive, then you end up pulling a plug on the whole thing and throw the baby out with the bathwater. And then everyone's frustrated by that. And then, no one looks good in that scenario. Marcellus, we were talking about legacy systems, and obviously within the public sector, Salesforce is a platform, and you're integrating, stuff out of the box, and sometimes it turns on and it's great, but often you have a legacy system that is 5, 10, 20 years old. Can you speak to how to work with legacy systems and best practices around that?
Absolutely. So so when we made that transition to Salesforce, one of the benefits behind it was going to give us the ability to be able to have our own app and portal system. Prior to this, 311 was dependent on a third-party vendor for those services, and the control and some of the things that we wanted to do, we were just unable to do. And so that transition may have been a transition that took some years because there were many conversations. Although we went ahead and continued and stood up what we were going to do, but this third-party platform was still out there, and residents still were using it, right? And so there was still discussions that we had to have with this third-party vendor to make sure that there was no confusion as far as in the public. Hey, we understand that there's this other option out here, but we're going to constantly tell the public to use our app, but residents may just be comfortable with using this third-party app. And so it was definitely a transition in the process, many discussions to move on for that. And then also just in this climate, this environment that we're in, certain certifications require transparency. And so therefore, there was definitely a need for us to move away from certain systems to have more transparency, to be able to share, because as a government agency, a lot of people want to see, what are you really doing? What's happening here? And we have to be able to answer those questions and be able to deliver those results.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think what we've seen with legacy apps is, again, it's knowing what your technical development capability is up front. Are you capable of integrating that legacy application? Do you really need a real-time connection, or can you pull data out of that app and put it in Salesforce on a regular basis? Maybe that's a way to make things a little simpler or to get a starting point. And then there's sometimes where, like, hey, we all have a lot of apps on our desktop, so everyone wants to roll everything into one interface, but sometimes you just have to accept that, hey, we're not going to be able to do that, or we don't have the bandwidth to do it at this time. Or often, the version of legacy app you're using, you're kind of waiting for an update, so it's going to be easier to integrate with Salesforce, and that always takes longer because the vendor will say, hey, we have a Salesforce updates coming out in March, but they don't tell you the year, and 2 years later they finally have the thing come out. So I think it's just again, it's proper scoping out front, and it's setting a timeline and amount of resources you're willing to commit to it. But we're mentioning kind of competition for the desktop and value in kind of prep for this webinar. You brought up something which I really haven't heard people discuss in reference to Salesforce, but I thought it's a really important point. It kind of gets to people's often unwillingness to change in looking at the competition for the desktop. Can you speak to this topic?
Sure. Yeah, I think that especially when you're working in companies that are small and medium size, there aren't a lot of these processes that this is the way that we always do it. So there aren't these standardization efforts or legacy systems that you have to kind of incorporate in. A lot of it is okay, well, it's easier for us to use Slack. It's easier for us to use Teams. Why am I going to then redo and re-put the information into Salesforce? Because I've already created a Teams chat and I feel like I've informed all of these people of the status of this particular project, or of next steps on another effort. So I think having people understand that Salesforce is much more than just a informative tool to help you understand the status of a project. It can help increase business operations over the whole aperture of the company. And creating that culture really takes having people see how effective it is when you have data integrity entered in on a reoccurring basis, understanding how dashboards can then be an effective tool for communicating to leadership and boards, board of directors, and helping them understand where the company's going in their vision. And that's only effective as the data in. If you don't have the data in, then you're not going to think that it's an effective tool. It's only as effective as the time that you invest in it. So you have to kind of create this buy-in culture and have a certain time frame and implementation of a small scope of, maybe of a project, 6 months, so they understand, like, this is the data integrity that you get from something like that. And then after you have that adoption, then you can kind of scale to larger steps of integration of Salesforce across the company. But utilizing that Outlook, like just that email button that is in Salesforce, is a great way to kind of start helping people realize, like, oh, I can like have all of my emails in here and everything's in here under this one customer. And that was a really great way to kind of help align teams on understanding the value of, oh, well, this person has left. I don't have the access to their email account anymore. And a great way to kind of show them, like, hey, this is a way to have even continuity of just what has been discussed with this customer.
That's great insight. Marcellus, have you come across this, within your group?
Sorry, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We deal with it actually on a pretty consistent basis, especially, in the midst of the pandemic and switching from communications of, a lot of things being email driven to now things being in the Teams chat, and using these different resources. And so over the years, what we've had to do is just constantly update our new hire training to ensure that when they come in the door, they know how to set up a folder or a rule in Outlook, right? Or they know how to use the team chats and build teams and understanding what we use that for, so that sometimes they don't just see it there and use it for whatever their individual reasons may be. And so setting those priorities and making sure that information flow is, if you get an urgent remark, you'll get that in the email, right? A Teams chat, that's more so communication between your team leads and your supervisors to maybe get an update on some information. And so definitely definitely deal with that, and also to the public, right? And so the public, they may want to reach us through using social media platform. We have a live agent option. And so you having these different resources just for the citizens to be able to get in contact with you, so that you can connect them with those services was definitely, it was important to have. However, the leading thing will be, they're going to pick up that phone and call, but we definitely had to make sure we have those other options, especially for our call floor staff, and that they were aware of these other options to be able to direct the resident appropriately.
That's great. And from my experience, like our saying internally is, if it's not in Salesforce, it didn't happen. And so we live that every day. People's compensation are actually tied to keeping Salesforce up to date. So not everyone within public sector organization has that flexibility, but we're careful not to undermine the use of it, because if you're asking people to use Salesforce and then simultaneously you're asking for a summary of what's in Salesforce over email, you're kind of speaking out of both sides of your mouth. So you really have to live it, look for information in Salesforce before you reach out to an individual or team to comment on what's already in there, because everyone hates putting information into Salesforce and then their manager doesn't actually look at it when they have a question about information in Salesforce. I think something that you touched on a little bit, Marcellus and Val, with Teams or Slack, we've started putting together guidelines around what type of communications go in Outlook versus Teams versus Salesforce. We're trying to capture everything we're working on externally, and we're trying not to use email and Teams for the same purposes simultaneously, because then it gets really confusing. Is it in Teams or is it in Outlook or Gmail or whatever using, and then people are using text. So I think even though we're talking about Salesforce, it's really important to have kind of guidelines around what type of communications. Like something urgent, we're going to put that in Teams. Something where we're attaching PDFs and so on, we're going to put that in email. How big is the community? How big is the CC list you're sending to? So I think having guidelines as an organization is really helpful, because when you're seeing the same information in Salesforce as in Outlook, as in Teams, if you're a new hire, that's very confusing. So that kind of gets a little bit to data, and Matthew McConaughey at Salesforce is a great ad out there talking about data is the new gold, but I haven't met too many Salesforce administrators or project owners who have said the data in their Salesforce instance is anywhere close to being gold. Kind of the exact opposite of that. So maybe we'll start with you, Val. Can you talk about like data quality, how you make sure it's at a level that your Salesforce project is going to work properly?
Yeah, so I think it's more about I think when you look at the data and maybe the gold standard of Matthew McConaughey, it's kind of like utilizing that data for decision-making processes for the company. So looking at like small businesses, medium-sized businesses, saying, okay, how are we using data analytics to drive major decision-making for M&As, like being able to say, okay, is this the right decision for our mergers and acquisition for this type of investment? Is this an investment for, how much more investment do I need to put into this customer? Is this line going to go anywhere? Kind of looking at it from that perspective. And I think that setting those lines and boundaries, like we talked about previously on the other systems that you use and what specific data needs to go in Salesforce, is the most important key to say, how is this data, can this data be used for data-driven analytics, for decision-making? Can this data be used for the executive suite to make decisions on business operations? Can this data be used at board of directors meetings for dashboards to say, okay, this is the health of our company. This is where we are in terms of prospective customers, current contracts, and this is like our way forward for the future in terms of how many customers we've talked to and where that's going to mature into sales growth. So I think that utilizing in that aspect for small and medium-sized businesses makes it really advantageous to say, okay, yeah, the data is the gold standard, but the data is only as good as what you put into the system and what the practices are of the company in order to make sure that that data has integrity.
Well said. Marcella, I know you're working with a lot of systems that are kind of generating the data on the fly, but like, what are your thoughts on maintaining data quality?
It's super important. We have we're helped out a lot by Octo in our situation, and it really boils down to the story that you want to tell as far as when you're sharing that data with certain vendors, and I think Val hit on it, and just to add, like for 31 operations lately here in the district, it's become a little bit politicized. So, for example, there's some council members that want to draw up legislation to get data out, especially about 911 operations, about 311 operations, and that kind of it is then turned and given to the public. But we also have to make sure that we're doing our job and educating the public on what they're looking at and what this data is really saying. Sometimes I think a lot of time people get complaints and say, we need a service request that's just other service requests, right? And so sometimes, yeah, the data may say that's something that you need, but when we go through the process of trying to create that, it will sometimes mess up a process that you already have in place. And when you have these relationships with different agencies and different services that they're providing, there's things that they need in order to be able to actually respond to what the resident is requesting. And if they don't have that information, then we're just kind of going through this endless cycle of the resident calling and not getting their issue resolved. And so definitely, educating the public on that is what helps with getting them to understand that, hey, I know I'm looking at how many service requests for trash recycling. Just because it's a high number doesn't mean that there's an issue. It could have been there was a snowstorm, or there was some major event where resources had to be diverted from trash to do other things. And so it's going to take a little longer to be able to resolve some of those issues. And so I think educating the public is very important on that.
Thanks, Marcellus. I would say data is like so critical because, unfortunately, it's something that people normally leave, to after the implementation. If you're going out and planning a great Thanksgiving, dinner, and you're rushing out to buy groceries at, noon on Thanksgiving, you're not going to get the best turkey. You're going to get some wilted spinach and beets, and you're really going to have poor quality inputs into your implementation. So I think you really need a plan around data, because you lose buy-in pretty quickly if people go into a Salesforce implementation and they see information that is incorrect or highly incomplete. And we really split it out in thinking about what's current, how are you handling current information? So is everything being logged that you need to have logged, and at what level of quality? And then how are you handling, historical information? They often say data ages like fish, so it doesn't look too good after a few weeks in your system. And some systems can survive having old stale data in there because people just swim around it. But other times, you're acting on that stale data, and what's the consequence of that? So we strongly encourage our clients to have a plan of how they're going to use their data. Often it's budget that's not allocated, so they kind of roll this implementation out, and then they didn't really think that their data plan is dependent on their own team entering in data. And there's many aspects of data entry that kind of amount to like a $5 an hour job, and your team probably doesn't want to do that type of work, unless you're making it as easy as possible. So something we certainly have help with when it comes to public sector people information and contact data and award information, but everyone's putting different types of data in there, so you really do need a plan, because it's one of the fastest ways to lose your team and lose the viability of your implementation is having poor data quality and not having a plan in the first place. So you're implementing something, you get the buy-in from the executives, or executives have gotten enamored with a dashboard or a pitch from Salesforce. How do you handle executive messaging, whether it's coming top down of you to implement something, or you're looking to transform your organization, expanding what you're doing in Salesforce? Let's start with Marcellus.
Definitely. I was talking with some of our technical team that was involved in this process, and one of the legacy system that we had before, we had it so long that there were just all of these different reports and dashboards in them, and we realized in the transition that we weren't going to be able to bring all of that over, and so we had to really sit down with the leadership of these different agencies and the CA's office, and really get an understanding of what they're looking for. Let's try to get an understanding of what your top 10, top 15 reports of the information that you need, a dashboard that you need to set up. And for example, with working with Department of Public Works, they control the snow command for the district, and anyone's familiar with the history of DC, snow is really important on how we handle snow. And so they, working with them, they say, okay, we need to build a dashboard, right? We need to build something to where when we activate our snow command, our snow operations, we can really be able to see certain routes that are being treated, all the way down to the manpower and the time that the drivers may be on the road, and calculating that and sharing resources between different government agencies and be able to see that. And so it was really important for us to, sit down with these different executives for these different agencies and be able to identify what the need is and what story that they wanted to tell. And then, also, I think we talked about it earlier, when you're going into these new systems, you want to make sure that that they have the buy-in. And so that's a definitely a good way to get that buy-in, to say, hey, I have this really nice, dashboard report where you just kind of you just open your email, and all the information you need is there.
That's great. Thanks, Marcellus. Val, same question.
Sure. So I think in private industry, it's a good idea to kind of set the expectations up front to your executive team. So saying, okay, I'm going to do a risk cost analysis for you on Salesforce. We're going to go and we're going to break this down into 3 different buckets. We're going to say, okay, for our small implementation bucket, this is the cost. This is the return on investment. This would be the benefit to the company, the risk, the cultural buy-in, and then any mitigation strategies for having it at this level. I would do the same thing at a medium level of implementation. So maybe that would require more teams, more licenses, more cost, do the same type of analysis, and then do it at a larger scale. I would also, initially recommend like the pilot program and recommend starting off at a smaller level so you can see if it's actually something that's feasible within the company. And the current team, adapts it from a cultural perspective and understands the data integrity and collaboration needed. Also, it's, we talked about having the right talent. So it's really important to understand, like, do you have the right talent that will understand how to use it? And if they don't, are we then incorporating effectively the right training that's needed for these individuals to effectively use Salesforce? And then, in each of these different buckets, then showing them what that product could be, so for a smaller bucket, is it more just like business operations? For a medium bucket, is it business operations and executive messaging for the executive leadership team and for the board of directors? And for larger business operations, is that going to include, product development and, across the like business operations for the company across the board?
I think that's good advice, Val. I mean, what we see with agencies that we work with is I haven't had anyone say once a year after Salesforce rollout where they say that was easier than I thought it was going to be. It took less energy, less time, less everything, and so you can say that for most technical projects. So I really do think like you have to message your executive team about the potential complexity. Val, you mentioned a couple times pilots. So certainly we've seen pilots and assessments, where there's a commitment of like time and financial and some small amount of technical resources be really effective to properly get an executive team to understand that, behind that cool, sexy dashboard, there's a lot of hard work of integrating systems and inputting data and making that, simple, tip of the iceberg really work for you. And you also need some flexibility that if things start getting, more complex, or often you force that complexity, you get 3 or 4 months into the project and someone says, hey, this looks great. Why don't we integrate this additional system or add this additional piece of functionality into what we're doing? All of a sudden, like that demands, more resources, and are people willing to commit or reallocate with that? So I think that's really important, to get the executive buy-in. Sometimes the executive buy-in is actually almost too much, where they're like, hey, we're getting Salesforce. And then, Marcellus, guess what? You're implementing it. So, we've certainly seen that. There's definitely some famous examples of that within, certainly certain undisclosed federal agencies. And so then that's when you kind of still quickly have to get in there and have, the executive team understand that, hey, we're fully into making this a success, but again, kind of walk people through, the commitment of technical resources, the cultural changes, a lot of what we've touched on in our previous questions. So we have a question here. So how do we get to better scoping and requirements, understanding to avoid third-party Salesforce system integrators from overpromising and under-delivering and increasing costs? Maybe Marcellus, I'll start with you on that one.
So I would say this was a bit tough because, as we mentioned earlier, usually Octo is kind of doing the legwork and creating the scope and building that relationship with those vendors and the Salesforce system. And then it's kind of being passed down to me, say, hey, here you go, right? Handle this. So I if I can pass that question, I think you all will have some great experience on that.
Sure. Val?
Yeah, I think there's you have to understand like the fluency of your team and the adaptability of being able to incorporate that system in. And what is the cost benefit of that? Like, are you already do you already have an effective system for incorporating that data? Is it really worth the cost to work with that third party vendor to utilize that system integration perspective, or like integration into your Salesforce dashboard? I don't know. I haven't seen that there's been too much of a, like in my experience in startups, of a propellant for that to be, you know, a high reward. I think that you know, focusing on the data integrity, and if that data integrity that you're putting in, if this third party integration takes off more of the manual work, then yes. But if it's something that actually increases scope, then that's where you have to kind of look at the cost reward.
All right, thanks, Val. And just following up on that, like Marcellus, on the cost side, like what you know, Salesforce, you know, it's, you know, whether you consider it expensive or inexpensive, you know, it depends on the success of the project, but certainly the integration work, the commitment of your own time from your team, you know, is a serious you know, resource, and ultimately, you know, financial costs. Like, how do you go to like keeping those under control and at least assessing what they are?
Absolutely. So one of the things that went into the cost for our integration was for transitioning to that licensing cost licensing based model, and so and then also making sure that support services. I can truly say during our time with Salesforce, we haven't had, maybe over the 5 years, I may can count on one hand how many outages or down times that we've had, and if it was an outage, it wasn't more than 30 minutes or so. And so making sure that we had an understanding of that, making sure that it was able to work with these third-party vendors is all kind of what went into that. And so that's kind of what we use to make sure that we continue to identify the budget, to be able to continue to use the platform, continue to grow with the platform. In our case, when we made the switch, just transitioning to a cloud based system, that was really the big part of the cost for us to say, okay, we do need to transition to this. But it helped in so many different ways, just for us to being able to have these different features and more control. And so I think as long as we kind of have that control, we continue to build that relationship. Those are some of the things that'll go into that discussion of continuing that model. Whether, and to your point, whether or not it was successful, while we were there, were there issues that we couldn't cross, barriers there that where we couldn't find a solution for, and so that is all involved in that discussion.
Excellent. Yeah, I think what we see is one, like a hidden cost driver is if you didn't scope out your user base. So you have one or two communities of users that need to use Salesforce, but you get into the projects 3-6 months, and all of a sudden you have a large third or fourth group that you decide you wanted to add into the mix. Maybe it's an operations team or a finance team that are going in kind of on a casual basis, and that can really expand licensing costs on you. So I think those are things you can kind of consider upfront. If you're excluding your user group, make sure you know why, and you wouldn't anticipate them coming in within a 12-month period. And then also, like, it's considering status quo. Like, if you're getting Salesforce, it's a productivity platform, so you're able to do something in a more productive, efficient way. So what is the current cost? Like, we often see with the users that we'll integrate to is that there is a manual overhead cost of several hours a week if you're doing a lot of things manually outside of Salesforce. And inside of Salesforce, hey, we're freeing up 2 to 3 hours a week. That can be pretty meaningful to most teams. Now, if you're investing that 2 to 3 hours in something non-work related, maybe the organization's not going to support it, but I think most organizations are efficient enough where that's not happening. So, like, looking at the cost of status quo, I think is an important element to to any assessment. Last question, because we have about 5 minutes left, and again, please add questions to the Q&A, is really like learning and talent development. So you're in a project and you realize, hey, this could be a lot better if, I had a little more, my existing team skill set was expanded, or, the second part is just staying on top of what's best practices. Obviously, the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence, incorporating that into systems is top of mind, across the public sector. So maybe Val, will start with you. How do you keep your team, trained up, and how do you stay on top of what can really support your organization with respect to Salesforce?
Yeah, so I think that messaging effectively to the executive team to say, hey, that training and integration of making sure that the team is stacked effectively is really important. So I think that initially individuals think that, like, okay, well, we're integrating Salesforce, so it's all going to be, we're just going to input data, everything's going to work out well, we're going to have these dashboards, and there's like a rose-colored approach to that. But the team doesn't necessarily understand, if you haven't used Salesforce before, how much training is required to effectively use Salesforce, especially if maybe your team isn't used to using it or using other tools like it. Right? So we need to make sure that we're supporting our team members with the effective training, with the effective Salesforce support staff, and not just like the maybe program manager or data analytics team, but having the right team that can effectively train them and walk them through setting up dashboards, how to make sure that your data does have integrity, making sure that you're able to incorporate your emails in effectively. So really understanding your team and their Salesforce fluency is really important to making sure that they have the right learning program for Salesforce, and that learning program then enhances your Salesforce data integrity and the overall business operations for your team and company.
Well said, Val. Marcellus, same question.
Yeah, no, that was definitely well said. I would just add, in our partnership, we wanted to make sure that there was a focus on the public sector, and we even got to a point early on where they dedicated a success manager, and there was constant communication between Salesforce and our developers, and also again seeing what the other jurisdictions were doing and what benefited them and what was unsuccessful and what was successful for them. And so bringing that into the picture is what really helped us kind of get to this point of also making sure that we collaborate with them. And, again, like Val mentioned, the training, for the people that are going to use it, it was vital.
That's great, Marcellus. Thank you. We had a question, kind of along this lines from, how do you start when you're a small federal agency? I think with learning and talent, I mean, the great thing if you're in, federal agency or even state, local government, there's a lot of Salesforce implementations out there. I don't know the exact number, but it's well over $1 billion of Salesforce business within federal agencies. So what we would encourage is first talk to your colleagues, within your own agency or peer organization, if you're in a congressional affairs or intergovernmental affairs team that you're running, or group that is managing a customer service or support function. Talk to someone, ask them what works, what doesn't work. Whether you're a team of 4, 5, 10 people, or you have multiple hundreds of people on that license. So I think understanding what people are using Salesforce, what problems they're using Salesforce to tackle is really important, what technology they're using. Obviously, when you're working with your account team, there's amazing account teams out there. There's some that are maybe, less than, not the best at communications. So I think it's really important just to like get out there, read what's out there, talk to your colleagues. And that's one of the best ways. And talk to the, public sector ecosystem. So there's, lots of people within, the vendor community, integration community, nonprofits that are using Salesforce, and buying someone a cup of coffee is a good way to come up to speed on best practices. Obviously, attending webinars like this, can help. So I think it's really just, keeping your eyes and ears open, really helps facilitate that. And then in terms of training your own team, there's a lot of, learning modules out there that can upskill your team, and just appointing, who's your internal Salesforce administrator and what do you need to do to get them up to a level that is going to support the needs of your organization. So we're 1 minute over. Great discussion. Thanks so much, Val. Thanks so much, Marcellus. Really appreciate it. We'll do a write-up on this, just summarizing some of the recommendations and insights, and then send it out to those of you on the webinar today. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.